At the beginning of our topic, I hope you support us with a like, subscription to the channel, and activation of the bell button, so that you receive all that is new. In the year 1625, an Italian nobleman named Pietro della Valle went on a tour of the Middle East. Della Valle was a prolific traveler. He journeyed around Asia, North Africa, and even India. He married an Assyrian Christian princess in Damascus, and now the two of them traveled together, journeying by horseback and camel, accompanied by local guides. At this time, travel in this region couldn't have been more dangerous. The Ottoman and Persian empires were at war, fighting over who would rule in Baghdad, and meanwhile, local bandits took advantage of the chaos to prey on travelers. In those days, lions even roamed in these hills. Due to these various dangers, Della Valle's guides were constantly on edge. It was June 18, 1625, when they spotted a distant group of tribesmen on the horizon. Their guides decided that they might be in danger, and began to search for a place to hide. In the distance, they spotted the looming mass of a series of enormous ruins, as Della Valle later wrote in his memoirs. Being suspicious to some Arabian vagrants, or vagabonds, for more security we removed a mile further, and took up our station under a little hill near some ruins of buildings which we saw from far away. Della Valle's group stayed in those ruins for several nights while their guides negotiated with the local ruler, asking for safe passage. During the day, under the baking Iraqi sun, Della Valle passed his time by walking among those monumental ruins. Our removal hence being still deferred, I went in the forenoon to take a more diligent view of the ruins of the above said ancient building. What it had been, I could not understand, but I had found it to have been built with very good bricks, most of which were stamped with certain unknown letters which appeared very ancient. I observed that they had been cemented together not with lime, but with bitumen or pitch. Della Valle was fascinated by the broken fragments of writing that littered the ground of this ruined place. He explored further and wrote down some of the symbols that he saw again and again stamped into the stones and pieces of clay brick. Surveying the ruins again, I found on the ground some pieces of black marble, hard and fine, engraven with the same letters as the bricks, which seemed to me to be a kind of seal. Amongst other symbols which I discovered in that short time, two I found in many places. One was like a pyramid, and the other resembled a star of 8 points. Della Valle and his wife didn't know it, but they had stumbled across the ruins of Ur, a city that had formed the center of one of mankind's first civilizations. This society was known as Sumer, and it was where so much of the world we know today first began. Eventually, negotiations with the local leader fell apart, and Della Valle's guides no longer felt safe camped out there in the ruins. They departed in the dead of night and fled to safety across the desert. In Della Valle's bags were a few of the clay tablets that he had found scattered around the ruins of Ur. These would be the first examples ever seen in Europe of a language that had been dead and forgotten for thousands of years. All the way home, Della Valle must have turned those tablets over in his hands, gazed at their mysterious ancient symbols. He must have wondered to himself, who had built those enormous mounds of brick and earth, all alone out there in the middle of the desert? What did the symbols on those broken pieces of clay mean? And if such a great city had once stood there, what in all the world could have happened to it? My name's Paul Cooper, and you're listening to the Fall of Civilizations podcast. Each episode, I look at a civilization of the past that rose to glory and then collapsed into the ashes of history. I want to ask, what did they have in common? What led to their fall? And what did it feel like to be a person alive at the time who witnessed the end of their world? In this episode, I want to go back to the very beginning and look at a society that is one of the candidates for the first ever technological human civilization. These are the people of Sumer who we call the Sumerians. I want to show how, over the course of millennia, the Sumerians would build a society that would form the blueprint for all that followed after. I want to show how they rose to invent writing, mathematics, and the wheel, and built the largest cities that humanity had ever seen. I want to explore what happened to cause their final and devastating collapse. In the highlands of southeastern Turkey, a range of snow-topped limestone peaks rise over 3,000 meters above the flat plains beneath. These are the Taurus Mountains. The mountains of Turkey rise so sharply that rain clouds find it difficult to pass over them. Instead, these clouds pool in their hollows and valleys, and give these hills an exceptionally high rate of annual rainfall. In spring and summer, the warm air means that the clouds are even denser, and violent thunderstorms rock these mountains, too, going of the stones of the valleys. As a result, this is a landscape shaped by water. The steep sides of the Taurus Mountains have been eroded to form streams and waterfalls, while underground rivers have cut into the rock and hollowed out some of the largest caves in Asia. Just as it has shaped the rocks, water has also shaped the beliefs of this region's people. The name of these mountains, Taurus, comes from the Latin word for bull, and the reason for this isn't hard to see. Temples have been unearthed all across these mountains, decorated with terracotta statues of bulls. Since ancient times, the people who lived here worshipped the storm god Teshin. They believed he rode on the back of a bull, perhaps because the sound of the thunderstorms reminded them of the thumping of enormous hooves. Accompanied with the cracking and booming of these thunderstorms, these heavy spring rains drain into streams and join rivers already flowing down from the snowy mountain passes of Armenia. Soon, these small rivers join together and flow down from the mountains and out onto the wide, flat plains beneath into great majestic watercourses that run together in near parallel for nearly 2,000 kilometers. The vast floodplain of these rivers is today the land we call Iraq. In Arabic, this area is called Bilad al-Rafidain, the land of the two rivers. In the West, it has been known since ancient times by its Greek name, combining the words Mesos, or middle, and Potamus, or river. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. These two great waterways are known as the Tigris and the Euphrates. For millennia, these rivers have brought life down into the flat floodplain of Iraq, and the source of that life comes from some of the most lifeless things, the rocks of the mountains themselves. Virtually all rocks are held together with tiny flecks of two different materials called quartz and feldspar. Quartz is a clear, glittering crystal formed from oxygen and silicon, while feldspar is a complex mineral derived from silicon. Together, they make up over 60% of the Earth's crust, and when rivers cut their roots through the mountain gullies and underground streams, their waters wash over the rocks and dissolve their soluble parts. But quartz and feldspar don't dissolve in water, and so, these tiny crystals are carried along by the river in a cloud of glittering particles. We call this substance silt. Silt is sometimes known by the more poetic name, rock flour, and its particles are smaller than a grain of sand. But these tiny specks can have an enormous impact. Soil with a high silt content tends to hold water better and promotes air circulation. For this reason, silty soil forms the perfect habitat for most plants. The rivers Tigris and Euphrates transport vast amounts of silt down into the lowlands of Iraq every year, and as a consequence, this flat stretch of otherwise arid desert has become exceptionally fertile. For the history of this region, and the history of all humanity, these tiny particles would prove immensely significant. Other than its rich clay soil, the desert plains of southern Iraq are an inhospitable landscape. In fact, this is perhaps the last place you might expect the first human civilizations to rise. For one thing, the climate of this region is extremely hot and dry. Summer temperatures can reach over 52 degrees centigrade or 126 degrees Fahrenheit. Rainfall is rare, especially in summer. Coupled with the strong winds that blow across these plains, this means that the soil is arid and windswept. Although the seasonal flooding of the rivers brings life to the earth, these floods are also unpredictable. In Egypt, the river Nile flows directly from the Great Lakes of Africa, which act as a stabilizing and regulating force. But the Tigris and Euphrates depend on the amount of rain that fell on the mountains of Turkey, Armenia, and Kurdistan, a quantity that varies greatly from year to year. Years of drought can often be followed by years of devastating floods, and during winter, the whole plain is covered with a thick layer of mud. The region of southern Iraq is also poor in natural resources. The land is essentially nothing but a floodplain made of clay and silt. There were no metals to be mined here, and virtually no stone. Because of all these challenges, it took early humans a long time to reach this hostile environment. In the far prehistoric, archaic humans like Homo erectus vied for survival in the upper reaches of the rivers. Archaeologists have found stone axes and other artifacts dating back to nearly 500,000 years ago. But the riverlands of southern Iraq weren't suitable for this hunter-gatherer lifestyle. But about 13,000 years ago, things began to change. The first nomadic hunter-gatherers began to settle down in permanent villages. These early innovators had noticed something interesting. They saw that when they threw away the discarded seeds of edible plants, that same plant would later sprout out of their rubbish dumps. This gave them an idea. They realized that if you buried plant seeds in the earth, fed them and watered them, more of the same plants would grow. These were some of the first farmers, and once they found a good patch of land, they quite understandably didn't want to move. They soon built houses nearby, and storehouses to keep food through the winter. They banded together into larger communities in order to divide the labor of farming and to protect their grain should anyone else try to take it. They learned how to take the clay from the ground and shape it into pots, but they were still limited to areas where the rains were plentiful, to the mountains and the foothills. From about the year 6500 BC, these human settlements began to spread. Century by century, millennium by millennium, they worked their way down the courses of the two great rivers, and into the inhospitable land of southern Iraq. Who these people were, what language they spoke, and what they called themselves, we have no idea. Today, we call this stretch of several thousand years the Ubaid period, named quite arbitrarily after the site where their first artifacts were found. As the Ubaid people moved down the rivers of Iraq, they began to notice other things too. They noticed that date palms grew in some areas of the river, providing them with a rich and delicious source of calories. They soon found out that these, too, could be cultivated and planted in orchards. They also noticed that these palms could provide shade for other more fragile plants, allowing them to be grown, too, beneath the harsh Iraqi sun. They made another crucial discovery, too. They realized that they didn't have to grow their plants only on the banks of the river. With a bit of hard work, they could dig channels that diverted the life-giving water inland. Now, they could grow crops just about anywhere, so long as you could dig a canal long enough. The people of this region would soon become very good at digging canals. Worked properly in this manner, this landscape could be immensely productive. In their fields, the people here grew wheat, millet, and sesame. In gardens beneath the shade of their date palms, they also grew pomegranates, grapes, and figs, as well as chickpeas, lentils, leeks, garlic, cucumbers, and watercress. But there was one noticeable patch of green in the midst of all this desert. In the south of Iraq, the rivers Tigris and Euphrates branched into deltas and shallow lakes before they meet the ocean, creating an ancient marsh landscape. Here, dense thickets of reeds grow, so tall you can't see over the tops of them, populated with buffalo, wild boar, and marshland birds. Since ancient times, the people here have built their houses out of reeds, binding them together into incredibly strong beams of up to a meter thick, and building large, vaulted houses out of nothing but reeds. It's in this marshy southern landscape that the greatest Sumerian cities rose. Just as Mesopotamia was watered by two great rivers, its lands were also populated by two great peoples. These were the people of Sumer and the people of Akkad. Over the course of their history, the Sumerians and the Akkadians grew together in such a symbiotic way that it's impossible to tell the story of one without the other. We know a decent amount about the Akkadian people in the north. They spoke a language in the Semitic family, meaning that it's in the same language family as the Aramaic of the Bible, and later Hebrew and Arabic. This language seems to have been indigenous to the region, and it shares grammar and words with many other languages that surrounded it. But the Sumerian people are much more mysterious. In fact, they are such a mystery that they have caused archaeologists to refer to what is called the Sumerian problem. Sumerians spoke what we call a language isolate. That is, it has no relation to any of the languages around it, and it's essentially in a language family all of its own. Sumerian was so alien to the region that early scholars who discovered its first texts didn't believe it could be a real language at all. They thought it must have been a kind of code used to communicate in secret. This alone has led some historians to ask whether the Sumerians may have arrived in southern Iraq from somewhere else. The Sumerian culture centered on the seacoast of Iraq's far south, and so, some have suggested that they may have arrived by boat. Some backing for this theory may come in the writings of Roman historian Flavius Josephus, who wrote down a Babylonian legend that he heard in the 1st century AD. It relates the story of a half-man, half-fish called Oannes who walked out of the sea and taught the people of Mesopotamia the secrets of culture. He brought them the knowledge of letters, sciences, and all kinds of techniques. He also taught them how to found cities, build temples, create laws, and measure plots of land. He revealed to them how to work the land and gather fruits. After teaching mankind all these secrets, Oannes leaps back into the sea and swims away. It's possible that in this myth, ancient storytellers have preserved some memory of the arrival of the Sumerians landing en masse by boat, and bringing with them their advanced urban culture. Some have even argued that the Sumerians may have come from as far afield as India. More evidence for the migration theory seems to come from the words that the Sumerians used for their professions. For more common jobs, the ones that involved manual labor, the Sumerians used old, pre-Sumerian words. Meanwhile, they brought new words with them to describe more sophisticated and urban occupations. For instance, the words for scribe and winemaker are both distinctly Sumerian. But others have proposed a more interesting theory which does seem to solve some of these contradictions. Although it does seem a little far-fetched, I think it is worth mentioning here. The clue to this theory comes, once again, from mythology. The Sumerian version of history was dominated by a devastating event of apocalyptic proportions. If you were brought up reading Bible stories, you may find it familiar. The Sumerians believed that in a time long before, in the time of their most distant ancestors, a great flood had washed over the world. This same story would later pass on into the legends of the Babylonian Empire, and from there, to the Hebrew poets who wrote the first books of the Bible. For this reason, the story of the flood is perhaps the oldest, continuously told story. And it's in this legend that the clue to the origin of the Sumerians might lie. The story of the flood is so striking that many historians with varying degrees of credibility have tried to come up with some historical event that may have inspired it, and history is actually full of great inundations. When the last ice age ended around 10,000 BC, global temperatures rose between 4 to 7 degrees over a period of about 5,000 years. Up until that point, vast ice sheets had covered the land in the north of the planet, reaching as far south as Berlin. But as temperatures rose, these ice caps melted, and their water poured back into the oceans. Global sea levels rose an average of 2.5 centimeters a year, until by then, the sea had risen an incredible 120 meters, or enough to completely swallow a 30-story building. Around the world, the sea engulfed vast regions of the coast. The land bridge that had once connected Russia and Alaska was submerged, separating Asia and the Americas forever. Low-lying regions of what is now Europe's North Sea flooded, turning Great Britain into an island. In the Middle East, the effects were felt just as dramatically. During the low sea levels of the Ice Age, the Tigris and Euphrates had flowed for a further 600 kilometers, joining into a single river and meandering along a stretch of low-lying valley wedged between what is now Iran and Saudi Arabia. This grand river would have met the Indian Ocean around the region of Dubai today. Some historians have argued that Neolithic humans may have made their home in this fertile valley, having journeyed down from the mountains of Iran. But as the glaciers melted, the sea advanced. Slowly at first, but with an increasing speed. Over the next 5,000 years, the coastline would have moved an average rate of 120 meters a year. That's over a kilometer every 10 years, or 1 meter every 3 days. If there were humans living in this low-lying region at the time, this event must have been utterly terrifying. The next centuries would see these people driven north by the encroaching waves which swallowed whole forests and villages. These people would have been pressed into ever-denser populations, forced to adapt as they went. They would have been a roving band of refugees, never able to settle anywhere for long before the sea made its next advance. This exodus would have continued until the planet's temperature stabilized, and the sea coast reached its furthest point right around the year 5000 BC, just at the time that Sumerian culture as we know it burst onto the historical stage. This is a theory that I think deserves some consideration, that as the waves of Semitic-speaking farmers moved down the rivers from the mountains to the north, they met another population coming up from the south, a ravaged and devastated people speaking a language that had evolved independently and telling tales of a flood that had drowned the whole world. This theory could be supported by that legend of the amphibious fish Manoans. Is it possible that the Sumerians came to southern Iraq not by boat, but actually walking out of a land that was now at the bottom of the sea? Another legend called the myth of Enki and Ninhursag relates a creation story in which the god Enki creates man in a land called Dilmun. Like the Garden of Eden, Dilmun is an earthly paradise. In Dilmun, the crow does not utter its cry, the lion does not kill, the wolf does not seize the lamb, the wild dog, devourer of kids, is unknown. Dilmun is thought to have been what is now Bahrain, an island in the middle of the Persian Gulf, that body of water that was once a fertile river valley. All we have on this subject is speculation, and until any further evidence is found, this will remain just a theory. But as a storyteller, I can't help but be drawn to this colorful explanation. When we try to work out the truth of what happened in this incredibly distant past, we are reminded that history is not a rigid set of dates and facts, but a continuing process of inquiry and debate. It can sometimes feel like mapping the surface of a planet in another solar system, or like exploring the dark depths of the deep sea, and all we have to work with are the small spots of light that history provides. We may never know the truth about where the Sumerians came from, but there is plenty that we do know. The Sumerians referred to themselves as a Sagigga, or the black-headed people, and the Akkadians called them Samatakadi, which meant the same thing in their own language. From carvings that depict Sumerians, we can see how they wore their hair, curly on top, and cut short on the sides. Common men wore sheepskin kilts, while the richer people would have worn colored fabrics spun from wool, decorated with tassels and beads. Among the wealthy, both men and women wore jewelry, anklets, bracelets, necklaces, and ear ornaments, made of copper and sometimes gold. Remarkably, we also have a great deal of evidence about Sumerian music. Like everything else, the Sumerians wrote their music down on clay tablets, and we've also discovered other texts that explain how to play it, including how to tune the instruments. Today, we were able to hear the sounds of the music that once played in the temples and courtyards of cities like Ur and Uruk. These two great peoples, the Semitic Akkadians and the Sumerians, formed a symbiosis over the next centuries that would see their cultures run in parallel, just like their two great rivers. They shared their successes and advances. They shared the cities that were even now growing to become the largest ever seen, but they also shared their failures. As a result, their fates became inextricably intertwined. The Sumerians believed that the world was a roughly circular landmass surrounded on all sides by a huge body of water. They believed that another ocean also lay above their heads, held in place by the solid structure of the sky, which occasionally let some of this water through as rain. They divided water into two types, that of the rain and rivers, sweet water, and that of the sea, bitter water. Sumerians called their homeland Kianjipar, which means the land of the noble lords. To describe the settled societies of the Sumerians and Akkadians, they used the word Kalam, meaning civilized, while they used the word Kur to describe the mountainous zones bordering the plains. Kur, in the Sumerian language, meant mountain, but it also came to mean rebellious, barbarous, and wild. At this time, that's how the outside world must have looked to them. To their south and west, the vast desert of Arabia yawned, a rolling sea of sand dunes where nothing grew, home to fierce nomadic tribes. To the north, the rocky Taurus mountains of Turkey and Kurdistan hemmed them in, full of hardy mountain people, while the Zagros mountains of Iran formed the edge of their world to the east. Today, the Arabic word for the region of Upper Mesopotamia still holds within it a sense of this feeling of isolation. They call it Al Jazeera, meaning the island, but despite the challenges of their landscape, the Sumerians flourished. They had no stone to build with, so instead they learned to make bricks from the river mud, mixing them with straw, gravel, and broken pottery, and baking them with clay. They made everything from pots and plates to sickles and writing tablets. They had no wood, So instead they harvested vast numbers of reeds, tying them together into bundles, and plaiting them together into mats. The Sumerians invented or adopted the pottery wheel, the wagon wheel, the plow, and the sailboat. Their buildings used complex arches and domes. They worked out how to cast metals such as copper, and later, bronze. The Sumerians were also avid mathematicians. They developed complex systems of measurement, as well as methods for dividing, multiplying, and calculating angles, even writing down the first ever multiplication tables on clay tablets. We actually use Sumerian mathematics every day. It was the Sumerians who divided time into the minutes and seconds we still use, and since their number system worked on a base of 60 rather than our system of 10, that's why we have 60 minutes in an hour. The reason for using 60 as the base of a number system is actually quite simple, and it's rooted in the design of our bodies. If you hold your hand out in front of you right now, you'll notice that each of your 4 fingers is divided into 3 segments. It is thought that ancient people would use the thumb of their right hand to tap each segment of the finger, counting up to 12. When they reached 12, they would raise a finger on their left hand, counting up the 12s. When you had 5 fingers raised on your left hand, you had 60, and you had to start again. The fact that there were 12 cycles of the moon in each year would have confirmed for the Sumerians that this was the number system intended by the gods. The 360 degrees we still use in angle measurement is another relic of this system. Due to this spark of ingenuity, Sumerian society grew at a slow but steady pace. They dug vast networks of irrigation canals that extended the agricultural zone around the rivers, and also allowed them to transport goods in canal boats. They built dams to regulate the flow of the rivers and ensure that the spring floods came in a more controlled way. In fact, the Sumerian language has a vast array of words to describe the different kinds of canals, reservoirs, dams, and lock gates required to control their water. Gradually, the landscape of southern Iraq transformed from dusty salt flats and marshy swamps to a green patchwork of farmland. Many historians have argued that it was the digging of these canals and watercourses that originally led to the greater social organization we see during the Sumerian period. These extensive systems of water management needed careful planning, engineering expertise, and mathematical calculations. Work teams needed to be organized and paid in food and beer. Foremen and overseers needed to be appointed, and all of this led to a kind of early bureaucracy that gave rise to the first true states. In the 1930s, historian Arnold Toynbee famously argued that it was just these environmental challenges in southern Iraq that created the conditions in which civilization could be created. The desiccation of the region impelled the fathers of the Sumeric civilization to come to grips with the jungle swamp of the lower valley of the Tigris and Euphrates, and to transform it. The ordeal through which the fathers of the Sumeric civilization passed is commemorated in Sumeric legend. The slaying of the dragon Tiamat by the god Marduk and the creation of the world out of her mortal remains signifies the subjugation of the primeval wilderness and the creation of the land by the canalization of the waters and the draining of the soil. The tough semi-desert landscape created what he called a stimulus and response effect in these early people. Toynbee argues that in conditions that are too comfortable, people have little need of increased social organization or technological development. In conditions that are too harsh, society finds it impossible to develop. He argues that it's in environments such as southern Iraq, where the challenges are numerous but not overwhelming, that a cradle of civilization can occur. According to Sumerian texts, the first city in the region was the city of Eridu. One controversial document known as the Sumerian King List describes Eridu as the place where the god Enki first decided that a king should rule. When kingship from heaven was lowered, the kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Ululim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Alaungar ruled for 36,000 years. For obvious reasons, many historians have questioned the reliability of this source. Some have even gone so far as to call it a piece of utter fiction, or a later piece of propaganda designed to legitimize a usurper to the throne. But the King List does tell us how the Sumerians, at least one point, thought of their history, and many have argued that Eridu may well have been the world's first city. Eridu was founded around the year 5400 BC. That's nearly 7.5 millennia ago. At this time, populations of woolly mammoths, survivors of the end of the Ice Age, still roamed in remote parts of the world. Eridu was populated by Sumerian speakers, and soon it would make up just one of a whole constellation of small cities that dotted the landscape of southern Iraq. These independent city-states were centered around their temples and ruled by priest-kings known as the Ensi. Records show that these Ensi were often assisted by a council of elders which included both men and women. Most of the largest cities in this period were probably no bigger than about 10,000 people. The borders of these city-states were defined by the courses of canals and specially created boundary stones, carved monuments left jutting out of the earth to mark the line between one territory and another. Slowly, these cities began to eclipse the old Ubaid culture that had preceded them. Art and architecture began to take on the form that we would truly call Sumerian, and technology also began to take huge leaps forward. This first period seems to have been a time of relative peace. There's little evidence of organized warfare or the keeping of professional soldiers in these early cities. Most towns during this period went without walls. One exceptionally ancient Sumerian myth called the Gifts of Inanna seems to capture some of the spirit of this period of transition. It describes technology and the refinements of civilization being handed down by Enki, the king of the gods, to his daughter, the goddess Inanna. She later passes them down to the people of Sumer. Holy Inanna received the craft of the carpenter, the craft of the coppersmith, the craft of the scribe, the craft of the smith, the craft of the leather worker, the craft of the builder, the craft of the reed worker. Holy Inanna received wisdom, the shepherd's hut, the knowledge to pile up glowing charcoals, the sheepfold. Enki teaches Inanna about family, the proper laws of inheritance, and the art of good judgment. But he also goes on to give her other gifts, some of which show that the darker side of civilization was already beginning to make itself known. Holy Inanna received the seed and the rebel lands. Holy Inanna received heroism, power, wickedness, the plundering of cities, and the making of lamentations. It may be that the ancient Sumerians already recognized right at the dawn of settled human society what the scholar Walter Benjamin would one day write, that there is no record of civilization that is not at the same time a record of barbarism. It's true that during this period, the Sumerians began practices that would begin a sorrowful phase of human history. Among them is the use of slave labor. They captured men and women from the hill countries outside their borders and used their labor to fuel the growth of their own economy. In the last episode, I used the metaphor of the death of stars to talk about the life cycle that empires often pass through, but we might also think about the birth of civilizations in this way. The first stars were born from gas clouds compacted together under the weight of their own gravity into a spinning ball of matter. Under enough pressure, the temperature of the star's core increased and finally, nuclear fusion began. The first stars burst into light. When enough people gather together in one place, that settlement obtains a kind of gravity. It draws other people towards it, and as the size of the settlement increases, so does pressure on its various systems. In some cases, this pressure results in those people being fused together into more complex forms of organization. Sometime around the year 30 to 100 BC, the first stars of these human settlements began to burst into light. That light was the invention of writing. One Sumerian epic poem called Enmerkar and the Lord of Arata gives the first known story about the invention of writing. This poem attributes the invention to a king who has to send so many messages that his messenger can't remember them all. Because the messenger's mouth was heavy and he couldn't repeat the message, the Lord of Kulaba patted some clay and put words on it like a tablet. Until then, there had been no putting words on clay. The Sumerians had two things around them in virtually limitless abundance. That's the clay beneath their feet, and the reeds that grew in the marshes and along the banks of the rivers. It's these two resources that combined to form the first human writing. Sumerian scribes would pick up a lump of clay big enough to fit in their hand. In fact, about the size of a modern smartphone. They would take a piece of reed cut into the shape of a wedge and print it over and over into the clay to form symbols. The distinctive wedge shapes of the reeds give this form of writing its name. We call it cuneiform. The oldest cuneiform clay tablets come from the city of Uruk and date to the late 4th millennium, probably around the 32nd or 31st centuries. This script originally consisted of pictographs, small pictures designed to depict objects so everyone could understand what they represented. These were first used to keep track of everyday things like rations and supplies. On some of these very early tablets, you can still see very clearly what they mean. A bowl of food is depicted with an eating mouth next to 6 impressions, and a sheaf of wheat next to 5. This indicates that a worker can exchange this tablet for 6 bowls of food and 5 sheaves of wheat. Scribes would have had to work fast, copying hundreds of documents throughout their day. Slowly, this pressure meant that the signs had to become simpler and more abstract. Before long, they no longer looked like the objects they described. After the year 3000, the number of symbols was reduced from around 1,500 to about 600, and someone else had the bright idea that each symbol could stand for a certain sound instead of a whole idea. This was the beginning of the first alphabet, but it meant that now only an educated few could understand writing, and soon, a separate class of scribes emerged. The human brain would never be the same again. People could now read the words of kings and scribes who had died hundreds of years before. They could also begin to write down everything that they had learned so it could be remembered, and more importantly, it could be built upon. Partly due to this ability to record knowledge, the technology of some around this time began to take even greater leaps forward. This next period of history would be known as the period of Uruk. The period is named after the city of Uruk, which by the middle of the 4th millennium BC, had grown into the largest and most powerful city in southern Mesopotamia. One of the key ways that historians mark the shift into the Uruk period is by observing a dramatic change that occurred around this time in the region as pottery. If you're thinking that the pottery must have got more sophisticated and ornate as technology improved, then you're mistaken. In fact, the ancient pottery of the Ubaid period was exceptionally beautiful. It was made on a device known as a slow wheel, and painted with distinctive geometrical designs in brown or black. It was a luxury item for the select few. The shift to the Uruk period saw a great increase in the amount of pottery produced, but the quality fell dramatically. Thanks to a technology known as the fast wheel, clay jars and pots could now be made in great numbers by workmen in intensive workshops. This was the first era of mass production. The booming economy of the Sumerian cities comes to life in their documents. The clay tablets tell us that in the city of Gursu, for instance, 15,000 women were employed in the textile industry. One factory produced 1,100 tons of flour a year, as well as bread, beer, and linseed oil. This factory employed 134 specialists and 858 skilled workers, of which the vast majority were women. Since there was no currency at this time, workers were paid directly in food and other goods. The minimum ration of an unskilled factory worker consisted of 20 liters of barley a month, along with 2 liters of oil, and 2 kilos of wool per year. Meanwhile, their supervisor would earn roughly twice this ration. The poor in Sumerian society were downtrodden and were probably pretty miserable. They often had to borrow food or silver from predatory moneylenders at crushing interest rates of as high as 30%. But despite this rising inequality, by the middle of the 4th millennium BC, economic advancement meant that the city of Uruk had grown into the largest and most powerful city in southern Mesopotamia. This was around the year 3500 BC, or over 5,000 years ago. By this time, nearly 2,000 years had already passed since the original founding of the first city at Eridu. That's enough time to take us from the present moment to the age of Julius Caesar. By this time, Sumerian civilization was already ancient, but the very earliest of the pyramids of Egypt would still not be built for another 900 years. In Britain, the Neolithic monument Stonehenge was at this time just a series of barrows and earthworks, and its large stones would not be moved into place for another 1,300 years. When writing was invented in Uruk in the 32nd century BC, the last population of woolly mammoths to survive the end of the Ice Age were still clinging to life on a rocky outcrop in the East Siberian Sea known as Wrangel Island. By this time, Uruk would have had about 50,000 inhabitants. That's only enough to fill a modern medium-sized football stadium. But at this time, it was the largest city that the Earth had ever seen. The world's earliest surviving piece of literature, known as the Epic of Gilgamesh, begins in this city. It is the story of a king of Uruk named Gilgamesh, who likely ruled sometime in the 3rd millennium. Whatever the historical facts of his reign are, Gilgamesh made enough of an impression as a ruler that he went down into legend as a mythical hero, 2/3 god and 1/3 man. Although there's much more myth than fact in this ancient tale, the Gilgamesh epic does tell us a little about how Sumerian society changed in the early centuries of the 3rd millennium. For one thing, it's clear that warfare had begun to increase in the region. The tale opens in the powerful city of Uruk, and one feature of the city is mentioned as a great source of pride. That's a ring of enormous fortified walls, as these lines from the Epic of Gilgamesh show. Behold the outer walls which gleam like copper. See the inner wall which none can rival. Touch the threshold stone, it is from ancient days. Go up and walk on the wall of Uruk. Inspect the cornerstone, and examine its brickwork. Is it not built of baked brick? It's clear that city walls were now a necessity, but we can tell from the great pride shown in Uruk's fortifications that they may have also been quite rare. In fact, throughout the story, the city is referred to repeatedly as strong-walled Uruk. We also get a sense of how the city was divided during this time, suggesting some level of urban planning from its rulers. These parts comprise Uruk. 1/3 for city, 1/3 for garden, 1/3 for field, and a precinct for the Temple of Ishtar. At the height of the Uruk period, the city covered an area of 2.5 square kilometers. It had a port on the river, along with workshops and cluttered houses. At the center of the city was Uruk's famous White Temple. It was elevated 21 meters, and covered in white gypsum plaster that reflected the sunlight and would have caused the temple to glow during the day. If you walked the streets of Uruk during this time, you would have seen markets full of produce like beans and lentils, pomegranates and dates, jars of date syrup, and oil. In the richer parts of town, houses would be built from baked bricks. But elsewhere they would be mud and clay, dried in the sun. The houses would likely be arranged in a chaotic way, creating a labyrinth of alleys and warrens, covered by reed matting to keep them cool in the heat of the day. Farmers would be carrying large bundles of reeds and wheat on their backs, and herders would bring their long-haired sheep and oxen into the city. Here and there, you would see men sitting in circles in shaded courtyards, sharing a large jar of beer in the center, all sipping it through long straws made of hollow reeds. While the Sumerians did import some wines from the northern regions, it was beer that they loved most of all. They had over 30 different varieties, with names like white, dark, cloudy, and sweetened with honey. Some of their beer was flavored with herbs. It was brewed directly from the wheat and barley of the fields, and if you bought the cheapest kind, it would often still have seeds of grain floating at the bottom. One cuneiform text has even preserved a kind of drinking song. I will summon brewers and cupbearers to serve us floods of beer and pass it around. What pleasure! What delight! Blissfully to take it in, to sing jubilantly of this noble liquor, our hearts enchanted and our souls radiant. We can imagine the conversations that these ancient people would have had around their jars of beer, probably not that different to the conversations you'd find in any bar or pub today. Some of these everyday concerns have been preserved in lists of ancient Sumerian proverbs. These groups of beer drinkers would doubtless have complained that they were not appreciated at work. I am a thoroughbred steed, but I am hitched to a mule, and must draw cart and carry reeds and stubble. Others would have commiserated about one of the oldest human concerns, not having enough money. The poor man is better dead than alive. If he has bread, he has no salt. If he has salt, he has no bread. As with drinkers in all parts of history, they would have fallen out and shouted insults at each other in the streets. If you were put in water, the water would become foul. If you were put in a garden, the fruit would rot. At night, people usually slept on their rooftops, since the heat inside the houses would have been too much for them. The city would have been a pungent mixture of smells. Pottery kilns and brickworks would have belched smoke throughout the day. There were no drainage systems in the roads, and people would have thrown their waste out into the street. In the houses, people laid down layers of clay, crushed gypsum dust, and reed mats to create a soft, carpet-like effect. From the epicenter of this great metropolis, the Uruk civilization sent out ripples across the world, and eventually, a number of similarly great cities rose up around it. But as the 4th millennium drew to a close, another Sumerian city was rising in power, and soon, it would take Uruk's place as the new center of Sumerian culture. It would flourish into realms of untold wealth, and push the boundaries of what humanity thought possible in the realms of art and architecture. It's the city whose ruins we open this episode with, and the name of that city was Ur. Ur was situated right at the point where the Euphrates River met the sea. It was a trading port and fishing town where seagulls would have circled, and fishermen came in with their catches of fish, oysters, and turtles. Its position both on the sea and the river would have made it a booming hub of the region as trade. As we've already seen, if you needed clay or reeds, southern Iraq was the place to be. But for virtually everything else they needed, the Sumerians had to import from other lands. But luckily for them, they always had something to trade. They were alone among almost all the nations of the ancient Middle East, in that they produced a large surplus and variety of food. Archaeology shows that due to their farming abilities, the Mesopotamians of antiquity enjoyed a far more rich and varied diet than their neighbors in either Turkey or Iran. We have even uncovered some ancient Sumerian recipes written down on clay tablets. This is the recipe for a dish they call tu, and it gives you a sense of the variety they enjoy. Get the water ready. Add fat, salt, beer, onion, rocket, coriander, semolina, cumin, and beetroot. Add them to the cooking pot, then pound leek and garlic together, and add. Let all blend and reduce to a pulp, then sprinkle with coriander and carrot. Boats full of wheat and grains, dried reeds, and figs were now forging up the rivers, bringing food to all the neighboring lands. In return, other resources flowed back. Copper came down from the mountains of northwestern Iran, and later by ship from the island of Cyprus. Tin traveled through the long mountain passes from Afghanistan, as it would throughout the later Bronze Age. Silver came down the Euphrates on barges from Turkey's Taurus Mountains, while gold came overland from Egypt, and by ship from India. Ordinary wood for everyday building could be chopped in the Zagros Mountains of Iran to the east. But for finer constructions, for palaces and ornate city gates, only the prized wood of the cedar tree would do. This was brought by ship from Lebanon, where it grew among the high mountain passes. In fact, one episode in the Epic of Gilgamesh relates the king's quest to slay a monster in the mountains of Lebanon, and steal this beautiful wood from its forest. The ancient Sumerians traded in what we would consider a truly globalized way. From their tiny coasts on the Persian Gulf, their ships sailed out to trading ports in modern Bahrain and Oman. From there, they sailed along the coast to trade with another of the world's most ancient and mysterious cultures, the people we know today as the Indus Valley Civilization. From there, the Sumerians got all kinds of spices and gemstones like carnelian, as well as the brilliant blue lapis lazuli that the Sumerians adored. They used it to make jewelry and amulets, inlays and gaming boards, musical instruments, and sculptures of astonishing beauty. All of this trade would have passed through Ur and swelled the city to a wealth that likely no other human habitation had ever achieved. Grave goods uncovered in Ur show not only the incredible wealth of its rulers, but also magnificent craftsmanship that suggests an advanced community of artists. One such artifact found in a royal tomb in Ur has given us an incredible insight into the lives and manners of the ancient Sumerians. It's an ornate, decorative piece of furniture, inlaid with a mosaic of shell, red limestone, and lapis lazuli. Its images show detailed scenes from everyday life around 4,600 years ago. Today, it is called the Standard of Ur. On one side, the artifact shows images of the Sumerians at war, the chariots pulled by donkeys, the soldiers wearing leather capes and helmets, the men carrying spears and axes. On the other side, it depicts the Sumerians at peace, farmers and herders working on one level, and above them, the scribes with their shaved heads sitting at their desks. At this time, urbanism in the Sumerian world was reaching its peak. By the end of the 3rd millennium, a majority of the region's population would live in cities, and in this newly urbanized world, the economic power of Ur remained king. Over the next centuries, its power expanded and contracted, and at one point, Some of its kings wrote inscriptions calling themselves both the king of Ur and the king of Kish, another city that lay nearby. This suggests that Ur may have subdued some of its neighbors under its political control. But by the mid-3rd millennium, it seems the influence of Ur began to wane. This was a new militarized age, when the power of trade and diplomacy seems to have no longer been enough. One city called Lagash truly came into its own in this era of violence. Lagash was a slaving city. It had grown rich by raiding villages in the hills, kidnapping people, and selling them across the region. Sometime around the year 2500 BC, Lagash fell out with its neighbor, a city called Umma. The dispute seems to have been over a stretch of farmland along the river, and it caused the two cities to go to war. One carved stone monument from this time, known as a stele, captures something of the spirit of this age. It is known as the Stele of the Vultures. The upper part of the stone is normal enough. It shows the king of Lagash, a man named Yanatum, leading his soldiers into battle. They wear leather helmets and skirts made of reeds, shouldering their spears. These spears would have likely been topped with blades of copper or bronze, and would have flashed red in the sun as they marched. The king is riding ahead of them in an early chariot, wearing an animal skin slung across his chest, with a spear and a container of javelins beside him. When the armies met, the stele shows King Yanatum of Lagash dismounting from his chariot, and proceeding to lead his men on foot. They advance in a phalanx, a tight square of men with broad shields protecting their fronts, and a porcupine of short spears jutting out ahead. The fighting was bitter. Yanatum was struck in the eye by an arrow, but he lived on to see his army to victory, as the inscription on the stele records. Yanatum struck at Umma. The bodies were soon 3,600 in number. I, Yanatum, like a fierce storm wind, I unleashed the tempest. As the soldiers of Umma tried to flee the bloody battlefield, the stele shows the soldiers of Lagash cutting them down and trampling them beneath their feet. There's something to this carving that to me embodies something of a change in the spirit of Sumerian warfare. It's a particular kind of nastiness that revels in the suffering of your enemies, and this is shown most clearly in the part of the carving that gives it its name. These are the vultures flying overhead, carrying the severed heads of the soldiers of Umma in their beaks, picking at their tongues and eyes. It clearly shows a kind of massacre perpetrated by the city of Lagash, and it does so with relish. Due to military victories of this kind, the slaving city of Lagash went on to conquer much of southern Mesopotamia. Lagash established what some historians have called the first true empire in the world, but its rule was short-lived. In these ancient times, administrating even one city was difficult, and the empire of Lagash, despite its military success, was soon critically overstretched. To make matters worse, King Yanatum seems to have ruled through what amounts to a campaign of terror. Unsurprisingly, his rule was unpopular, and revolts rose up against him. As the hated empire of Lagash fractured and collapsed, the ruler of one of its subjugated cities seized his chance. He was the king of Umma, the city whose defeat and humiliation is depicted with such relish on the stele of the vultures, and his name was Lugalzagis. It's not clear exactly what made Lugalzagis so successful, but it's clear he was animated by an ardent desire for revenge against the empire of Lagash. Perhaps he had even been at the battle when King Yanatum had slaughtered thousands of his fellow citizens. He rose in rebellion against Lagash, and quickly toppled kings that were still loyal to the empire in the cities of Kish and Larsa. Then he marched on the great city of Ur itself, and the mighty walled fortress of Uruk. These both fell in turn, and the rebel Lugalzagis moved his capital to Uruk. Finally, he marched on the city of Lagash itself, the heart of the empire, and it's here that fiery vengeance in his heart burst out. The city didn't hold out for long. Lugalzagis burst over its walls, sacked the city, and burned it to the ground. Even by the standards of the time, this seems to have been a shocking act, as one piece of Sumerian poetry recalls with sorrow. Because the man of Umma destroyed the bricks of Lagash, he committed a sin against the city's god. The god will cut off any hand raised against him. Nay Nadaba, the personal goddess of Lugalzagis, make him bear all these sins. After sacking Lagash, Lugalzagis' momentum seems to have been unstoppable. He worked his way north, up the course of the two rivers, and soon, he had conquered all the regions that Lagash had once claimed. One inscription written by him even claims to have conquered all the lands between what he calls the upper and the lower seas, meaning from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean coast. The great god Enlil gave kingship of the land to him, the region from the lower sea through the Tigris and Euphrates to the upper sea. 32 kings gathered against him, but he defeated them and smote their cities, and prostrated their lords, and destroyed the whole countryside as far as the silver mines. Admittedly, this is probably something of an exaggeration. The Sumerians had never been able to maintain distant colonies or occupy far-off lands for very long. It's more likely that Lugal-Zaggis pulled off something like a successful raiding party on the coast, perhaps looting some towns and cities, and bringing treasure back to Uruk. But this was the first time that a Sumerian prince had ever made this claim. For them, this upper sea was the western edge of their entire world, and the idea of a king who might conquer all the lands between the seas began to possess the imaginations of all the kings who came after. But King Lugal-Zaggis, like the rulers of Lagash before him, had made the critical mistake of overstretching his resources. This empire was simply too big. Before long, civil wars and rebellions broke out between the various Sumerian cities. In this time of chaos, the other great people of Mesopotamia began to fancy their chances at ruling. These were the people who, up until this moment, had been something of a junior partner in the civilization of southern Iraq. These were the people of Akkad. One man would soon lead them in an outright rebellion against the Sumerian Empire. He would go down in history with a name that in Akkadian means the one true king. That name was Sargon, and he ushered in the twilight of the Sumerian age. Like many episodes in Sumerian history, the origin story of Sargon of Akkad is one you might find familiar if you were brought up on the stories of the Bible. He was born sometime in the middle of the 24th century BC, and legend has it that as a baby, he was found in a reed basket on the banks of the Tigris. He was found by a gardener who worked in the palace in the city of Kish, and who brought him up as his son. But like the biblical Moses, this foundling child had big ambitions. There seems to have been something special about him. Something about his charming manners meant that he was soon taken on as a cupbearer in the palace, bringing wine to the lords and royalty of the kingdom. This was a position of high honor, and a way for a young man to gain influence at court. The young Sargon must have proven himself in other ways too. That's because he was soon entrusted with a mission of the utmost secrecy and importance. At this time, Kish was still part of Lugal-Zaggis's Sumerian Empire, stretching over all the lands between the two seas. The Sumerian king Lugal-Zaggis was away on a distant campaign, possibly fighting in the lands of Syria or putting down a rebellion in a far-flung province. The young Sargon was given a small band of fighting men and told to travel to the city of Uruk, where Lugal-Zaggis kept his royal court. Their plan was to strike the city in a surprise attack, to knock out the capital of this new empire, and free the city of Kish from imperial control. It was a daring plan. The tall city walls of Uruk, immortalized in legend, must have looked daunting to the young Sargon and his men as they readied for their attack. But Lugal-Zaggis had taken much of his army with him on campaign, and left few behind to defend his capital. The attack came as a complete surprise. Sargon's men overcame their defenses, poured over their walls, and the defenders fled. Sargon captured the city, and before reinforcements could arrive, he broke down several sections of those famous city walls. It was a deeply symbolic act, and a strike against the might of Lugal-Zaggis's empire. King Lugal-Zaggis must have been enraged. He swung around from his distant war-making and marched back home, gathering all his subject kings to him as he went. Inscriptions record that as many as 50 kings may have marched under his banner, and their task was easy enough, to crush the forces of one small city-state. But Sargon seems to have been one of those characters from history, one of those geniuses like Hannibal or Napoleon, who are able to turn battles in their favor no matter the odds. We don't know how he did it, but in a pitched battle with the whole massed force of the empire, it was Sargon's army that emerged victorious. Lugal-Zaggis was captured, and Sargon marched him through the gates of the holy city of Nippur wearing a neck stock, a heavy piece of wood clapped around his neck and shoulders like an oxen. This would have been humiliating, of course, but here again is where Sargon sets himself apart from other rulers of the time. That's because he seems to have had something of a merciful streak. The old king Lugalzagus wasn't killed. Incredibly, he was allowed to continue on as the governor of Uruk, so long as he swore an oath to the High King Sargon. Sargon founded a new city to act as his empire's capital, and he named it Akkad. From there, he would go on to conquer much of what the preceding empires had before, as one inscription beneath a statue in the city of Nippur claims. Sargon, the king of Kish, triumphed in 34 battles over the cities, up to the edge of the sea, and destroyed their walls. He bowed down to the gods, and the gods gave him the upper land up to the cedar forest, and up to the silver mountain. Sargon didn't make the mistakes of his predecessors. At each city he conquered, he made a point of destroying the city's walls, reducing its ability to defend itself, and therefore reducing the likelihood of it rebelling against his rule. He conducted a ceremony to symbolize his mastery over the whole land. He washed his weapons in the waters of both the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean Sea. But once the dust of war had settled, his achievements went on. He made efforts to centralize the empire's administration, and even reformed the dating system. His reforms strengthened the central state and increased the stability of the empire. In many ways, he was something of a progressive and enlightened ruler. But Sargon was also Akkadian, and he was what we today might call a nationalist. Until now, Sumerian had been the official language of royal inscriptions on palaces and temples. But during Sargon's reign, Akkadian began to be used in official inscriptions for the first time. The cuneiform alphabet was now re-engineered to write Akkadian, and Sargon also gave himself the new title, King of Akkad. He appointed only his fellow Akkadians to key positions in the government, and garrisoned Sumerian cities with Akkadian troops to ensure their loyalty. The two people of Mesopotamia who had lived and grown together for millennia were now beginning to drift apart. Resentment in the southern Sumerian-speaking cities began to reach a boiling point. Sargon ruled for 55 years, and towards the end of his reign, this resentment bubbled over, as one later Babylonian text recalls. In his old age, all the lands revolted against him, and they besieged him in Akkad the city. But he went forth to battle, and defeated them. He knocked them over and destroyed their vast army. For the meantime, it's clear that Sargon's flair for battle kept his empire together, but as the old king weakened, virtually all the southern cities burst out in open rebellion. When Sargon of Akkad died around the year 2284, his two sons had to take over and try to fix the mess he had left behind. The first of these sons was called Rimesh. He ruled for 9 years and spent most of them in bitter battles to reconquer the rebellious Sumerian cities of the south. He crushed rebellions in Ur, Uruk, Lagash, and Adab, and one of the years in which he ruled is even known as the year that Adab was destroyed. When Rimesh died, Sargon's other son, Manishtushu, took over. He seems to have resorted to the kinds of terror tactics that had once made the kings of Lagash so hated. It was Sargon's grandson, a man named Naram-Sin, who would return the empire to its former greatness. He managed to quell the Sumerian rebellion in its southern heartlands, and return the empire of Akkad to stability. Naram-Sin didn't rule only by force. It seems he made some effort to reconcile the two intertwined peoples of Mesopotamia, breaking from his grandfather's title King of Akkad and ruling under the more diplomatic title King of Sumer and Akkad. But this didn't entirely heal the rift there was even now continuing to grow between these two peoples. Part of the problem was that the Sumerian people were no longer the primary cultural force in the region. For centuries, Akkadian had been gradually replacing Sumerian as a spoken language. Some of this may have been down to the official policies of the Akkadian Empire, discouraging the use of Sumerian in official documents. But it was also affected by the increasingly cosmopolitan makeup of the empire. Sumerian, as we've seen, was a language isolate with a different structure and sound to all the languages around it. But the people who lived in all the surrounding lands spoke languages that were linguistic cousins of Akkadian, all in the Semitic family of languages. They had the same grammar, and even shared sounds and words with Akkadian. Learning Akkadian for them would have been like an English speaker learning French or Spanish, while Sumerian would have been like learning Korean. Akkadian was just easier to learn for these people, and so, it would naturally become the language of trade and commerce. The people of Mesopotamia had been largely bilingual for centuries, but gradually, all Sumerians would have learned to speak Akkadian. And fewer Akkadians would have needed to learn Sumerian. Slowly, the Sumerian language began to fade. But the days of the Akkadian Empire were also numbered, and the Sumerians would get one more chance to leave their mark on the world's history. When the great Akkadian king Naram-Sin died, his son Shar-Kali-Shari took over. He was Sargon of Akkad's great-grandson, and for years into his reign, a great celestial sign would have appeared in the skies overhead. Far out in the depths of space, nearly 200 million kilometers away from Earth, a giant ball of ice and dust 40 kilometers across flew past, sometime around the year 20 to 13 BC. This was the comet Hale-Bopp. It would spend the next 4 millennia or so flying through our solar system on a deep elliptical orbit, until it flew past the Earth again as a blazing streak of light in the year 1997. It was the brightest comet with the longest tail that has ever been observed in our night skies. It remained visible with the naked eye for 18 months. In 1997, the sight of the comet in San Diego, California caused 39 members of an